Guys, this is going to be one of the most important videos I would advise all of us to watch as Africans. But anyway, most of you who live in South Africa, this is highly important because you see, most times when I study about South Africa, I see the effects of the historical, events that actually encapsulate lots of violence against males, violence against females, violence against whites, violence against blacks, violence against Indians, violence against coloreds. And those issues, those effects of all the trauma that's encapsulated in these instances of violence seem to be transferred downwards, generationally, and then they really impact society, so to speak. And so in this video, really emotional video of this parent. Her name is actually Theresa Mordor. She actually had to come, to the fore, in the news to really raise up this issue about her son who was abused in an elite school, and at the end of the day, because of the fact that the boy actually found it difficult to find the words to communicate his experiences, I think he ended up in suicide. And this is actually really, really pathetic emotional event that actually occurs as I continue to conduct research in this line of violence in South Africa. I see this a lot of times happening, not just to females but also males and then the children. And I think this is really unfortunate. So Theresa Mordor has decided to sue this really elite school. And many times I usually thought that because of the way society is actually structured in South Africa, and the township schools weren't really sort of like taken care of. I think this is one argument I usually hear a lot from many of the campaigns from many parties, that the township schools weren't really taken care of. And so many middle class and high class South Africans they began sending their children to these private schools, these elite schools. But for this kind of event to be occurring also in an elite school, it means that even the rich or probably the middle class South Africans aren't really spared in this regard. And so she's actually suing the school for to the toll of 60 million rand for compensation for the emotional shock and trauma and the financial toll that this suicide, which her son actually sort of like resorted to escape all the trauma he had been experiencing due to the abuse he actually had been experiencing in school. That was actually his final sort of like solution. I think this is really unfortunate, really, really sad. And so as parents, as Africans generally, we really have to understand how this whole thing with abuse, especially at the level of children, really function. In South Africa, for example, there are some really scary statistics. It says that more than 10 victims, especially for this particular case in this elite high school now, it says more than 10 victims have actually come forward with allegations against the former St. John's predatory teacher. So there's one actually teacher who's actually this predatory teacher, and more than 10 victims came forward. But it says that the original case was stalled and remained dormant for 2.5 years, and that's why Theresa Mordor has decided to come up. I think she has even set up a non-governmental organization to really take this bull by the horn and fight, because the silence sort of like the speed with which the investigation is actually going is actually really shocking. You see, it says that the accused, whoever is this predator, is actually is a male, and the accused is still at large, and there's no arrest and there's no bail hearing heard. And so this is why she's really angry. You could hear from this video how really emotional the whole event. It would happen to any parent, actually, any parent, to have this kind of experience go on, and yet the accused still looming large, and the school isn't really sort of like really pushing for sort of like an investigation with this case that actually lay dormant, according to reports I found on this website. We'll be doing a deeper analysis at the end of this video on the effect and what has really happened, what has gone on, especially with regards to this case. But anyway, some statistics in South Africa actually show that sexual violence is actually widespread in South Africa to the tune of 35.4%, which means that 1 out of every 3 adolescents report having an experience or experienced a form of sexual abuse before the age of 18. This is disastrous. It says that child protection activist Luke Lamprent actually highlights that boys especially who are actually who experience this abuse before the age of 13, they usually lack lack the language to identify as victims and face significant barriers to speak out, including shame and societal expectations of masculinity and homophobia, and then the myths that actually surround male victims, as they become perpetrators. So these factors end up becoming or contributing to the fact that male victims, they end up being 2 to 5 times more likely to attempt suicide, with many seeing it as the only way to escape their pain. And I'm sure this is actually what the child of this family actually must have felt in South Africa, where there's so much expectations of masculinity and all of this. Then when a male is actually abused before the age of 18, there are really difficult words to find to really express this, even to the parents. And that's why parents actually have to now start learning to engage in these really difficult conversations to really help and check with the children as they get back from school, to really understand what probably their deeper problems, that their deeper trauma really are, before they engage into adulthood. Before I go into the video with this discussion between Teresa Modo and this newscaster, I think in Newsroom, I think his name is Soli, I just want us to go quickly and listen to this MK MP. I think her name is MP Mokoena. She's one of those MPs of the MK party in the parliament that usually really has really interesting points from the MK perspective anyway. But she also has become an adult, and she had this really short excerpt from a narration in her speech in parliament, where she explains how she was also abused as a child and how she has survived that trauma to end up becoming an MP. I'm really proud of her. Let's take a quick listen before we go into the main video.
Today, I share not only the grim reality of gender-based violence in our country, but also a deep personal story of my own. At the age of 5, my life was marked by an experience that no child should ever endure. My mother, a determined woman pursuing her education while raising me, trusted a female family member to care for me during her night classes. Tragically, that trust was betrayed in a way that shattered my innocence. I was too young to fully comprehend what had happened, but the memories of that moment, where I was, what I felt, remain vivid and unforgettable. Before leaving, my abuser told me not to tell my mother, and as a trusting child, I complied. Those memories stayed buried for years, only to resurface later under the weight of a further trauma. Years later, as a university student, another violation took place. This time, it was in the hands of a friend's father. I remember feeling very paralyzed, not just in the moment, but for weeks, for months, and years afterwards. It was then and in the depths of that trauma that the memory of what had happened to me 13 years earlier came rushing back. This time, however, I was not silenced by someone else's command. I was silenced by my own shame and self-blame. Sexual abuse is insidious. It manipulates you. It makes you believe that you are completely on your own and that you are complicit in your own violation. It convinces you to shoulder the blame for the actions of others. It shapes how you see your world, how you see yourself, and how you navigate. But I stand here today not as a victim, but as a survivor. And as a survivor, I have a responsibility to myself, to my daughters, to the women and children of the nation to speak out, to finally break the silence and to demand change.
Yeah, so that's really unfortunate, and how these victims in South Africa end up surviving to adulthood and miss a lot of trials. Because you see, one thing about trauma is that those who are traumatized end up traumatizing others, and it's a really long battle, because it kind of like channels the kinds of people meet in relationships, in all these kind of things, and then at the end of the day, we have a society that's really fragile. But anyway, let's now go quickly and listen to what Teresa Modo has to say about her situation with this elite high school, St. John's High, and how her child went through the whole traumatic stages of grooming and all that before and deciding to take his life as the only way out to escape the traumas and the nightmares he actually felt as an abused teen in South Africa.
Thank you.
Can I start with you,
Yes.
Teresa? A bit of a background into your son, firstly. What kind of a human being was Julio, and the background to him ultimately choosing to take his own life?
Julio was a very bright and academically gifted child. He had endless thirst for knowledge and was accepted into an international university to study physics engineering just prior to his passing.
And that never came to be because of what happened. A bit of background into exactly when it is that you discovered this.
So Julio was sexually abused at school from the ages of 9 to around 12, 13. And he suffered in silence for over a decade without knowing really what was the cause of his post-traumatic stress. And that was only discovered and come to the forefront when St. John's actually disclosed that there was a sexual predator. And at that point, his mental health just took a really deep decline.
Yeah.
He was not able to deal with the trauma and the traumatic flashbacks and felt that his only way out was to take his life by hanging in a medical facility in Randburg, just around the corner.
And I'm terribly sorry for this because it is still hurting. Teresa, but by the time you found out about what was happening, how far gone was this particular issue for Julio? And in particular, why, in your view, do you think that he decided that the only way to resolve this was to take his own life?
So Julio suffered with extensive and complex PTSD, which none of us were really aware of why until October 2021. And when it became known that his nightmares were actually real and this did happen to him, we had 2 or 3 years since we came back to St. John's that he was really anxious, traumatized, and out of his body. He didn't understand why he was feeling so triggered. So it took, he was back for A-levels at St. John's, and in those 2 years he had a very contradictory experience because he was enjoying A-levels, but he would come home covered in goosebumps, unable to understand why he felt so triggered and so anxious. Yeah. So it was a good 2 years, and then after the announcement and the disclosure of sexual abuse accusations by the school, he really just, his mental health declined rapidly, and he, as Robin said, blamed himself. He blamed himself for not saying anything at the time. He blamed himself for not saving other people. He blamed himself for not being able to speak up. Yeah. And that tragically led him to take his life.
Teresa, I want to come to you next, because what is of importance now is how the school has dealt with this matter. You're clearly not satisfied, which is why you're now suing the school. But interesting, the News 24 article that we have quoted here, they are saying they interviewed the school, and the school appears to say that they do not agree with, quote unquote, your claims on the matter. How would you respond to that?
Well, firstly, I'd respond in terms of saying the claims will be dealt with in an appropriate and competent court. Yeah. What is very clear is that there were things that they didn't do, and those things cannot be undone because they weren't done in the first place. And there is a duty for schools to report matters, even in the cases of reasonable suspicion. And there is sufficient indication that they did not report. And tragically for us, Julio was around 9 or 10. And if we had been aware at that point that there was something suspicious that had happened, we could have given him treatment. We could have addressed the concerns.
Yeah.
So the real tragedy of these circumstances are that until we require and request civil action, nothing actually happens. Nothing changes. We have instances internationally where nothing's happened in churches and institutions and schools. The most recent being the resignation, or the resignation actually of the Anglican bishop 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he was forced to resign by survivors of sexual abuse that took place, that they were aware of. Not even that he was a perpetrator. He was just aware of them and did nothing.
Yeah.
And you know, all it takes for evil to prevail is for good men and women to do nothing.
And I suppose this is what you are trying to force this institution to do, and it is to account. St. John's is a prestigious school. It gets top results every now and then. Do you think that how they've dealt with this was in part in their way to preserve the image of the institution and perhaps less with your suffering and heartache?
I think that would be highly accurate. I would say that their initial response, or lack thereof, was really in favor of protecting the reputation of an elite school, and with very little regard to the survivors of the abuse. And that isn't just my son, Julio. There are several other survivors who have come forward in the case, and they deserve to be heard as well. And this is a question of civil accountability.
Yeah.
This is a question of making sure that our society holds reputational elites or not to account. Nobody is above the law, and this is the law that needs to actually be addressed in order to get civil accountability.
Teresa, if I could just give you the last word. This is a way to try and make your son be remembered for something.
Absolutely.
Your message to parents who may not be aware that things are happening to their children, behavioral patterns perhaps that they need to pick up on, what is your final message to unsuspecting parents?
My final message is that children may not feel comfortable coming forward to their parents, as sadly and as tragic as that is, and that they need a voice so that they don't suffer in silence. We've gone to a long extent of registering a non-profit organization in order to try and support the youth and give them direct access through their cell phone to mental health services. And that really is what I'd like to express to parents and to children, is reach out for help. It's not too late.
Yeah. I'm terribly sorry for your loss. I can feel your pain exactly where you sit. I feel it. I'm a parent too, and I'm terribly sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for raising your voice about this. Teresa Moda.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, guys. Really unfortunate. And I think I found a really set of interesting comments from TikTok that actually spoke to the fact that kind of like gave more meat to this video. And it says that, you know, I think this really interesting comment from this guy is Red Soviet. It says, where is this school? And it says that the school is in Houghton next to King Edward. I never liked that school as a person, heard too many scary stories. I believe everything he went through. Another comment here says that, you know, from Moriah Legongola, it says that this is the most expensive school in Johannesburg. Imagine. So it's kind of like one of those really expensive schools that as a parent, when you pay the exorbitant fees, you expect that your child is protected, you know, from these kinds of instances. Yet, you know, such events actually take place in this kind of schools. And I found on Tech Central, the idea of the school fees that is really paid, in this St. John's College. I think it's the top of the top in Johannesburg. It says that the annual tuition fees is 206,768 rand, and the boarding fees is 145,844 rand, and the total altogether to send a kid to this school, I think in a year, is 352,612 rand in a country where the unemployment rate is 33.3%, so high that one in almost 4 people are jobless in South Africa. And so to be able to work so hard to gather this amount of funds to be able to send your son to or daughter to this kind of school, to probably assist in helping them get a safe education, so to speak, in a country that's really fragile, and end up having to lose a child to a predator like this, I think it's really devastating. But anyway, let's come to understand what's really been going on with this case. I found a really interesting report on the Jewish on SAJR, I think it's South African Jewish Report .co.za, that kind of like goes deeply now into the activism about the boys, in South Africa, because it appears that the boys in South Africa are being neglected, because all the whole argument with violence and all that seems to neglect boys, and many boys are really suffering and dying in silence. So this Jewish Report, this activist here actually, is kind of like fighting for boys in South Africa. So to describe this son of Teresa Modo here, it says that he was a beautiful brown-eyed young boy born into a loving family. He was exceptionally bright with a talent for gymnastics, competing at national and international levels. His parents enrolled him at St. John's College to give him the best opportunity for his destined academic success. Being small in stature and a late developer made him a target for bullying, and the school recommended that he have weekly counseling sessions with the head of pastoral care to help him cope. So these are the struggles of this young boy, from the Modo family here. But anyway, it says that these sessions gave the head of pastoral care an open mandate to meet Julio. His name is Julio Modo, to meet him one-on-one, and provided him with the perfect opportunity to isolate and groom Julio. So from this report, we're beginning to get hints that this abuser here is the head of pastoral care. This is really, really sad. I think pastoral care should speak to a kind of like a pastor, so to speak, that actually provides, quasi-spiritual support for these kinds of children who end up being victims of bullying, so to speak. But anyway, at the end of the day, it says that this head of pastoral care then had opportunity, an open mandate to meet Julio one-on-one, and provided him, it provided this head of pastoral care with the perfect opportunity to isolate and groom Julio. And this whole perspective of grooming is something that we also have to understand, because there was an activist that actually in this same discussion with Zoli spoke about grooming as a way of grooming the child to be able to inculcate and not be able to speak out, in terms of this kind of traumatic incidences and when they happen. And so the children are groomed, and that's part of the cycle of the abuse, and at the end of the day they find it really difficult to report. So anyway, let's go on quickly. It says that this pastoral head of pastoral care then became a trusted figure for Julio Modo and his concerned parents by appearing to show real interest in Julio's well-being. This head of pastoral care slowly started showing interest in Julio's well-being, you see. So he said that he introduced Julio to rock climbing and gave him special privileges, which then became their secret, and used these to build a bond, ultimately to ensure this innocent child's silence as he groomed him and sexually abused him. It says that despite always being encouraged by supportive parents to speak openly, Julio couldn't disclose the details of his abuse. For more than a decade, he buried his pain, believing that he was the only one who had been harmed. His family struggled to understand his deteriorating mental health as he became withdrawn, anxious, depressed, and unhappy at school. Following 2 years of counseling, his psychologist diagnosed complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and she gently tried to get to the bottom of what had happened. He remained trapped in suppressed memories of sexual trauma. On November 15, 2021, it says that St. John's College released a letter notifying the school community of allegations of sexual abuse by several past pupils at the hands of this former teacher and head of pastoral care. Could this be the piece of puzzle missing in trying to understand their son's deteriorating mental health? Together with his psychologist, Julio Modo's parents read the letter to him. His body language was telling as he dropped his head, saying, "Oh, so there were other boys. I thought I was the only one." This beautiful young woman named Julio, this beautiful young man named Julio Modo, and his tragically and he tragically took his own life by hanging himself with his belt on 5th of November 2022. I don't even know how, a young kid like that would have learned how this could have happened. But it shows the strength of trauma as a really deep problem that, pushes people to learn certain kinds of education, so to speak, which are strange kinds of education in how to probably carry out certain things in life, you see. So you can imagine the pain that he really went through. It says that so he took his life with his belt while in a secure private psychiatric facility where he had been admitted as a high-risk patient. Just 2 weeks before his admission, Julio signed an affidavit at Norwood Police Station confirming his sexual abuse by the accused from the age of 9 till 12. So it only took 3 years to really damage a young mind, a young soul, a young beautiful spirit, to the point where this young pupil would decide that the only escape out of this whole mess that he had been engulfed in was suicide. This is so devastating. So it says that the school commissioned an internal review into the matter, which remains confidential. Only a redacted summary of the report was shared with the school community. However, 2 independent complaints were taken by staff of St. John's Preparatory School to their head during the tenure of the accused from 2002 to 2013. And these were alleged to have been appropriately dealt with, appropriately in quotation marks. So it appears, in other words, that it appears that this school, St. John's, wasn't really taking these cases seriously. So it says that it was appropriately dealt with by the prep head at the time. And the report found that no improper handling, the report found no improper handling of complaints, but South African law states that when a reasonable suspicion or actual report of child abuse, when these cases are raised, institutions have the legal duty to report it to the South African Police Service and submit what is called a Form 22 to initiate an independent investigation. It says that there's a study by an Optimus study on child abuse and violence and neglect, especially. That's the problem in South Africa's cases of violence, is neglect. It says that 35.4%, of abuse has actually been kind of like observed in South Africa, which interprets that 1 in every 3 adolescents report having experienced some form of sexual abuse before the age of 18. Child protection activist Luke Lamprecht highlights that boys often lack the language to identify as victims and face significant barriers to speaking out, including shame and societal expectations of masculinity. So it says for this particular case, as I said to you guys earlier, more than 10 victims actually had already come forward with allegations against this St. John's Preparatory teacher, this head of pastoral care. But, many of these cases remain dormant for even as much as 2.5 years, in the Northwest due to lack of investigation. It says this head of pastoral care remains at large. I would have really been interested to know what race this head of pastoral care was, whether black or white or Indian or whatever it is. But anyway, it says that there's a colonel Colonel Niemand. He revived the case on November 18, 2024. And, the National Department of Public Prosecution now has agreed to centralize this case in Johannesburg High Court. And a trial date is still pending. So it's unfortunate that this is actually where this family then had to sort of like find itself, to the point where this boy was so damaged and so, you know, disturbed. He had nightmares, dreams, and was so full of fear every day, to the thought of going to school became scary. And I really know that kind of trauma. I really understand, because certain instances in the lives of males, you know, sort of like replace different images in their minds. And at the end of the day, you know, places like school, which are really important places according to society to go to as often as possible to get development, become a trauma in itself, ending up, you know, leading to ultimate thoughts of ending, you know, the whole trauma by, you know, some form of elimination, so to speak. And so this is really sad. This is a really sad story. I really hope that, you know, the South African authorities can really slowly start taking this up, the whole case of violence. I remember one of the reports I made, Thabo Mbeki spoke about South Africa as a deeply violent society, and I really don't know what wisdom President Ramaphosa or, you know, the members of the GNU would have to deploy to be able to contain the amount of violence that's actually, characteristics of South African society. But we're really hopeful and still hoping that, you know, at the level of the African Union, South Africa can even get support, because the whole problem is overwhelming just for one nation to solve. And I think that, you know, external help is actually needed to really help South Africa come out of this myriad of cases that actually characterize its history and its present. But anyway, what do you guys think about this video? What do you guys think about Theresa Modo's really emotional speech? Share your thoughts in the comments.